Hello and welcome to EGA's webinar, A New Era for Brazil-China Relations, What Lula's Leadership Means for Brazil, China, and the World. This webinar will commence in approximately 1 minute. During the duration of the webinar, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to send them in the Q&A. Thank you.
Welcome to today's webinar produced by EGA entitled A New Era for Brazil's Foreign Relations. Today we're going to talk about what President Lula's leadership means for business in Brazil, China, and around the world. I'm Leigh Wedell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of EGA and a China consultant, and I'll be the moderator today. I'd like to take just a minute to frame our conversation today, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So as most of you know, President Lula has just returned from a week-long visit to China where he was greeted as a very old friend of the Chinese people. While Lula had to postpone his trip for illness, he quickly rescheduled, but a delegation of over 240 Brazilian business leaders did in fact go to China as scheduled. When President Lula followed shortly thereafter, a smaller delegation of business leaders went along. As per usual with these types of state-level visits, there were a lot of agreements signed. They covered tech, they covered semiconductors, they covered satellites and soybeans, and a lot of sustainability was featured. So we'll talk about that today. And there was clearly an effort by President Lula to re-engage China, diversify the economic relationship, and secure investment. Yet the geopolitical implications of his trip were equally notable. Lula is positioning himself largely as a global statesman in contrast to his predecessor, Mr. Bolsonaro. He's connected with the leaders of the US, France, Argentina, and now China in just his first 100 days in office. Clearly, elements of his trip were also designed to distance Brazil from the US approach toward China right now, which is marked towards a lot of competition in the tech and economic space. And we're also working very hard in the US to engage allies in that competition. So notably, Brazil and China agreed to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the US dollar. Lula met with Huawei, which has been in the crosshairs of the US government, and they signed a series of strategic and economic deals, and even discussed their positions vis-a-vis Ukraine. So for Chinese and Brazilian firms alike, though, there was an official senior level blessing for more engagement and economic activity. That's the good news for companies in both markets. But as most global leaders will tell you, right now navigating the geopolitics is one of their top challenges. It's complex. Here today to talk about that complexity, we have an expert panel, and it's my honor to introduce Larissa Wachholz, partner at Valia and senior fellow at the Brazilian Center of International Relations. Welcome, Larissa. Claudia Trevisan, Executive Director at the Brazil-China Business Council. Welcome, Claudia. And Publio Madruga, EGA's Chair for Latin America. Hello, Publio. I'd like to start with a rapid fire, just running around the group in a word or a phrase. How would you describe President Lula's recent visit to China? Larissa, let's start with you.
I describe it as re-engagement.
Re-engage, great. Claudia.
I would use the word multipolarity.
Great. And Publio.
I would say bold.
That's a diplomatic answer. Okay, so we know his visit was a really big deal. It was his first visit outside of the Americas, right, since starting his new term. So why don't you take 2 minutes then and just expand a little bit on your answer. Larissa, re-engagement. Can you explain 2 to 3 outcomes that you think really highlight that word?
I think it's important to see the context in which the trip takes place. So you have a new government in Brazil that's just starting, but you also have China reopening after almost 3 years of COVID restrictions. So it is a re-engagement in both sides, in my view, because the last state visit from Brazil to China was in October 2019. So a few months before the whole, like 4 months before the whole COVID started. So there was a state visit from Brazil to China in October. Xi Jinping visited Brazil in November, and afterwards there were no more direct contacts. So I think this is the one of the elements to it. But I think also it was important for Brazil to go to China and say, look, we value this partnership. This is very important for us. We do value a multipolar world. So I do agree with multipolarity to Claudia's argument. And I think it is important to say that China is it's an important partner for Brazil's development strategy. So re-engaging with China in that regard was very important in my view.
Great. So Claudia, we have agreement with you on multipolarity. How would you highlight some of the outcomes from the trip? That
I agree with Larissa that I think the key outcome was the reestablishment of political confidence in the bilateral relationship. We had 4 years during the previous government that relations with China were not exactly friendly. And there was a very strong alignment with the United States, particularly the United States during the presidency of Donald Trump. So I think it was important to send this message that China is a very important partner of Brazil, and that Brazil wants to re-engage, as Larissa said. And I think the second most important thing was the broadening of the institutional architecture of the relationship to include the issue of climate change and decarbonization. Besides the joint communiqué on deepening the global strategic partnership between Brazil and China, the two presidents also announced a joint statement on combating climate change. And this document created a group of discussion about environment and climate change. So the two governments will engage in a regular basis to discuss these issues. And finally, going back to my choice of multipolarity, there was an emphasis in all the language, the narrative of the visit on things that Lula values a lot and were very important in his two previous governments, which is the defense of multilateralism, the defense of a multipolar world, and the defense of a bigger role for developing and emerging markets in the global order.
Great. Publio, would you like to add to that? I think you are on mute.
In my opinion, I agree with both of them, but I think the whole trip was a way of Lula bringing Brazil back and himself to the spotlight of foreign relations. The whole thing about the UN Rio agreement and the size and the scope of all the business strategic agreements, the whole entourage that were with Lula there. And this whole thing made it a bold move from him because he showed that he's up to fight for the Brazilian interests, Brazil in first place, and he will try to make his foreign relations based on our interests, not caring too much about what others will think about it, and he'll position them, each player, into their place, not like doing what people would or want him to do. And that's why I think it's a bold move.
Great. So I think back to Larissa, the question on everyone's mind is, and the title of our panel today is this a new era in Brazil-China relations, in fact? How would you characterize for us a little bit Brazil-China 101? Can you kind of walk us through what the relationship was under previous administration of Lula, how it differed under Bolsonaro, and where you think it's going now? Are we in a new era, in fact?
I think the relationship between China and Brazil really reflects a lot of the economic situation of the two countries. So if you look at the trade volume between Brazil and China and how it increased exactly from Lula's first presidency, and it was not due to Lula's first presidency, it was because China was growing at a very impressive speed, and it became a big it was a country that demanded a lot of commodities that Brazil was able to supply. So all countries in the world that could potentially supply commodities to China benefited a lot from China's economic development. So I do like to frame the recent history between the two countries from this economic perspective, because I think it has to do a lot with how China came to where it is today. So 4 decades of very fast economic growth. The fact that Brazil has been one of the main destinations of Chinese investment in Brazil, Brazil has been one of the main destinations of Chinese investment in the world, is also telling to that, like, it is part of China's strategy. It is normal that once an economy grows to the size of what the Chinese economy is, nowadays, that this country increases its investments overseas. So this is what happened to Chinese investment, and Brazil was well placed to receive these investments, also because it was a period in Brazil where we had big needs of investment in capital-intensive industries, and for a lot of domestic reasons, we didn't have big companies that were able to take on these investments. And there was a legal framework in place that was somehow advantageous to investors that wanted to take up these projects. So long-term contracts and some particularities of the legal framework that were suitable for these investors. So in my view, the difference now is basically that in the past 4 years, although economic relations kept going very well, we did have a lot of political noise and some gray zones in the relationship that I agree with Claudia are trying to be settled now, but overall numbers say that they demonstrate that the relationship really grew in this period as well. I think what we're trying to say is that as the world faces new challenges and sustainability being at the center of it, Brazil and China should prepare to act together in this new challenges that the world faces. We still face some of the biggest problems of developing economies. We have a lot to be concerned about in terms of just increasing the income of the Brazilian population. So investments overall in the country are welcome. And if the Chinese are also partners for that, I think Brazil will definitely value these partnerships very much, although it doesn't mean excluding any other partner.
Well, so that I want to pick up on that. On his visit, Lula said nobody can stop Brazil from continuing to develop its relationship with China. And he seemed to align a lot with China on the push for a multipolar world. So Brazil-China relations also impact, of course, as you're saying, excluding no one in the world, Brazil-U.S. relations. And a lot of what you said in your answer there kind of also applied to the U.S.-China relation in some way. So let me ask perhaps a sensationalist question for you all, a yes-no question. In terms of the U.S., did the U.S. lose an ally in this? Publio.
I don't think so. Like, Brazil is still...
It's a yes-no, Publio.
No.
Okay, thank you. Claudia?
No.
And Larissa?
No.
Okay, I think we're unanimous on that. And if I had a vote, I would absolutely echo that. So Larissa, can you walk us through a little bit and unpack why you say no?
Well, because Brazil is not even in a position to place itself in these issues between Brazil and China. You mentioned between China and the US. You mentioned in the beginning of your talk that China and the US has a lot of issues related to their tech and economic positioning. None of these issues are issues to Brazil. Brazil is not one of the top economies in the world, as are the US and China. Brazil gains, as any developing country in the world gains, from a multipolar world, because it opens space for different types of partnerships that can address different problems that we all have. So definitely the US has been a very traditional and long-standing partner of Brazil, more recently a lot in also the political aspects related to democracy in Brazil. So I'm sure that Brazil values that a lot, and no one has a doubt about the long-standing compromise of a lot of American companies in Brazil as well. So I don't think we have to choose between one area and the other. Just one more detail I want to add. If you look at the profile of Chinese investments in Brazil, they are not actually competing directly with areas in which American companies have traditionally invested. So I think they're quite complementary, and I don't think we should place this discussion in terms of losing an ally from one side or the other.
Great. Publio, did you want to add a little bit? I know you wanted to continue.
No, what I think Larissa said most of this, if not all, but what I think is that Brazil cannot afford to lose allies. Like, what we have to do is to put ourselves into what we're good and look for partners and have our relationship with those partners related to what we can do bilaterally with them. Right? Some things for United States, some things China, Europe. It's not excluding. It's how choose to relate to each one of those players in the scope that they want to relate to us.
Yeah, I asked that question as probably most of our listeners and viewers will know too, that this trip followed on the heels of a trip by the French president to China, the EU commissioner, and then, of course, China's spectacular and surprising announcement of brokering the, Iran-Saudi deal. So it is in the U.S. a lot of focus on allies and where do they stand and where is the scorecard. But I have actually indeed heard directly from the Chinese government too that an ally is an ally, and that we've made a lot of progress with different deepening economic relationships, but allies are allies. So I want to pivot now to business and investment. So let's segue over to starting with the Brazil-China deal. Publio alluded to it a bit in his opening remarks. The deal that allows firms to trade in their respective currencies and bypass the US dollar. Lula said, and I quote, "Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. Why can't we do trade based on our own currencies?" So Claudia, can you tell us both what this means for foreign relations and then also the implications for businesses?
I think, first of all, this deal is obviously part of the effort from China to increase the internationalization of the RMB, to increase the use of its currency, both as for trade and also as a reserve currency. This push for internationalization, it has many years already, and I think it gained more speed after the sanctions that were imposed on Russia by the United States and by other Western countries because of the invasion of Ukraine. For Brazil and Chinese companies, I think the main impact is the reduction of transaction costs in the exchange rate operations, and also the possibility that other countries that do not have access to financing in US dollars to participate on the bilateral trade. And one result for Brazil, it will be the increase of the participation of the RMB in Brazilian foreign reserves. Brazil is one of the few countries that has surplus in the trade with China. Last year, China responded for almost half of all the surplus that Brazil had with the world. And the 2 years before that, the participation was even higher, was 66%. So it means that Brazil will receive more RMB than send reais to China. And last month, the participation of the RMB in Brazilian foreign reserves surpassed the one of the euro, and the RMB became the second largest currency in Brazil foreign reserves, with a participation of 5.37%, compared with 4.74% of the euro. This is still far from the participation of the US dollar, which surpasses 80%. But I expect an increase in the operations in reais and RMB. But I think this process will be slow and will not threat or will not end the dominance of the US dollar in Brazil-China trade relations. The speed of this process will depend a lot on the decision of each company that will need to evaluate their structure of revenues and expenses to decide if it's advantageous to receive RMB for their exports or not.
Great. And so that's interesting. Larissa or Publio, did you want to add anything to that? I know this was a big feature of the trip. Yep, Larissa.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with Claudia. I think we should see this as an attempt to initiate transactions that can be trial transactions for specific operations in which it will make sense. So I don't think we're thinking about a large-scale change. I think we're mostly trying to reduce overall transaction costs where it will make sense and providing more space for diversifying that area as well.
Okay, great. So in addition to the deal, there was a lot of talk about the Brazilian mega delegation, right? More than 240 businesses went, 30 business deals were signed, 15 state-to-state deals were signed. So as we look at that, Claudia, could you talk a little bit about what we know about the deals that were signed and just your overall impression of what the delegation, the business delegation, took away from the trip?
Mm-hmm. I think there were three kinds of deals. No? The first one, the most important ones, are the presidents, the joint communique on deepening the global strategic partnership between China and Brazil, and the joint statement on combating climate change. Besides that, there were 15 deals signed between government entities, and roughly 1/3 of them deal with the area of science and technology, including cooperation in space, information technology, digital economy, and the joint construction of a satellite, which is probably one of the first agreements between two developing countries about in science and technology. It's an agreement that was signed by Brazil and China in 1988, and now they decided to launch the number 6 satellite of this program. And the third group of deals are the deals that were signed among Brazilian and Chinese companies. There were a total of 34 agreements, and about 1/3 of them refer to cooperation in renewable energy and decarbonization. I think for the companies, it's one thing that Larissa mentioned in the beginning of our conversation. There was a great expectation for many executives and business people to go to China. Almost all of them hadn't been in the country in the last 3 years. China is the main customer for many of them, like Vale, the mining company, that almost 60% of their exports go to China. We have the meat exporters, JBS, BRF, that also have China as their main market. We had Embraer, that is the airplane manufacturer that wants to go back to the Chinese market. So there was a lot of enthusiasm about the possibility of going to China and engage with their counterparts.
Yeah. So in terms of that, so now we have a lot of deals signed and we have a lot of connections made. So Publio, can you talk a little bit about how you see the opportunity for Brazilian companies in China? And do you focus on, Claudia pointed out, renewable energy and meat? Of course, there was a concession made to Brazil before they arrived. They lift the ban on meat exports. So there was definitely an effort to promote that sector. Publio, how do you see opportunity and what sectors do you see are ahead?
In my opinion, like there's no doubt that agribusiness still holds the best opportunities. Meat, soy, still leading this. When they took off the bearing of the buying meat from Brazil, it's a big deal for JBS, like BRF. Those are things that are always on like hunting them because the Chinese, their main market, they sell a lot to them. But if you look at the range of companies that were listed to participate on the president's trip, we can see the interest of Brazilian companies in China go far beyond that. There was a handful of private agreements signed, and I think like energy is a big thing right now. Renewables and this focus on the climate thing that we're looking at. So China will probably be a big player, even big player on our energy and renewable and funding our energy transition to the green energy.
Great. And so as we were talking too about just the geopolitical issues, I wanted to just ask a quick question of Claudia on one of the very sensitive sectors in geopolitics right now, semiconductors. I noted they did sign some agreement for cooperation in the semiconductor space. This has been a challenge for China right now as they've been cut off by the US largely from semiconductors, and the US is pressuring the Dutch and the Japanese as well. How can you frame the Brazil semiconductor deal in terms of the geopolitics and what it will mean for Brazil?
The semiconductors, they were part of the deal that were signed by the Ministry of Science and Technology from Brazil and China. But it is very vague on what it means. Now, it says that the two countries will cooperate in the development and application of new technologies, including, among other things, semiconductors. It's not clear that it means that China will invest in Brazil in this area, or Brazil would participate in research and development in this area. But I think the main problem China faces with the sanctions or the export controls from the US is the difficulty in having access to high-end semiconductors, not to the more sophisticated semiconductors. And I don't see how the cooperation with Brazil would solve this problem. From the Brazilian perspective, Brazil would very much welcome Chinese investments in Brazil in the semiconductor area. Brazil has a long-term aspiration to have semiconductor production in the country, but it's not clear at this point what exactly this agreement means.
Okay, so let's look on the flip side then, the landscape for Chinese investment then into Brazil. And let's talk about what Brazil is doing to actually attract the Chinese firms at this point. So Larissa, one of the goals that Lula identified in the trip was to diversify the trade portfolio with China. He said he'd like to encourage more Chinese investment in infrastructure, technology, and other sectors. How is he doing that?
Brazil is traditionally a very open country for foreign investment. We don't have particular restrictions for sectors or countries of origin of investment that is not welcome in Brazil. Brazil is one of the most open economies in the world for that. So I think what he means is that we will keep encouraging Chinese companies to invest in Brazil because there are areas, we just mentioned renewable energy, sustainability, areas that will be key to the decarbonization movement the whole world will go through, in which Chinese companies are absolute leaders. Let's not forget China is the world's largest investor in renewable energy. So their companies are well prepared to also develop projects in Brazil. Brazil has very low energy generation costs for solar, for instance, as well as onshore wind. So I think these areas will definitely be in the spotlight, and all the supply chains that can be part of it, and that could be stimulated by that. For instance, green hydrogen, I think, is one of the cases. So I think in practical terms, what Brazil wants to do is to remain open for overseas investment, as it has always been. In terms of trade, we do have a very big challenge on diversifying the type of exports, the type of products that we're able to supply for a country like China that has a huge commodity need. As China makes the transition into a consumer-led economy, the opportunities for countries that have things to export in general will only increase. But then I think the issue is, how can Brazil compete with worldwide brands? Everyone looks at the Chinese market and everyone wants to place their products there. So I think we have to face our own domestic challenges on building brands, building products that will be competitive, not only in the commodity spectrum, but also in products that can go directly to the final consumer. So this, I think, has to do more with challenges that Brazil will need to face domestically in terms of making its economy more competitive, more productive, and building brands that can actually compete internationally. This could be done, I believe, through partnerships with Chinese companies, especially in areas that we already know that China presents a large demand. Only in the agricultural sector, we have a few examples of that, like supply chains that Brazil could structure with the help of a long-term demand from the Chinese side. So I think these initiatives could be in the radar in the years to come, and I hope that they will be there. But they also have a lot to do with our own internal analysis on how we can be more competitive.
Got it. And so, Claudia, when you're talking to Chinese firms and promoting investment into Brazil and partnerships with Brazilian companies, what do you tell them they should be looking at? Like, how do you promote the market to them? What do you find their objections to be, or their hurdles and challenges to be to entering the market?
Mm-hmm. I think the concerns of the Chinese companies are not very different from the concerns of any other foreign company that invests in Brazil. There is a concern with the high level of taxes, the tax and the complexity of the tax system. There is a concern with exchange rate and the fluctuations of and the unpredictability of exchange rates in Brazil, and also a concern with the regulatory framework. So they want to have a stable regulatory framework as any other foreign company wants. And I think one of the main attractions of Brazil to Chinese companies is the size of the market. Brazil is the has the seventh largest population in the world. And it's also a market where Chinese companies can deploy technology. And I think one of the main examples of that is State Grid, the largest electricity company in the world. Brazil is a very important market for State Grid. More than half of State Grid assets outside China are in Brazil. And they won the bid to build the transmission lines that connected the hydropower of Belo Monte in the Amazon to the southeast region of Brazil, where the consumers of energy are, most of them. And it's more than 2,000 kilometers, it's 2 lines. And they use a technology that they have, is called ultra-high voltage, that allows for the very efficient transmission of electricity in long distance. So there are not many countries in the world where they can deploy it, and Brazil is one of them. And I think you have other opportunities, other like electric cars that Brazil is still in very beginning, and China has brands for that can compete in this market, and they can be and build in Brazil. And I think in all other areas that some of them Larissa mentioned, low carbon agriculture, green finance, I think there are a lot of opportunities and business that Chinese companies can do in Brazil.
So you've talked about energy, and everyone has mentioned renewables and sustainability. So let's spend a few minutes on that before we wrap up. I think we've noticed that in terms of the domestic agenda, sustainability made a big comeback in Brazil. There was a lot of deforestation dropped right under Lula's previous tenure, and then it kind of waned, and now it's back. And now it's back on the agenda. Publio, can you talk about now with Lula back in power, how his priorities on sustainability differ and how that featured in this trip too?
I think Lula's priorities for his whole term are lower deforestation. That was a big deal in elections and has been a big deal forever. So this is something that he is going to be one of his flagships policies. Energy transition and decarbonization will be in his agenda too. When he put Marina Silva as Minister of an environment and brought her back, and he sent a sign that this is a main issue for him, that he cares about it, and that he wants Brazil to be repositioned as a global leader in environment discussions. So I think he's going to be some of a champion for this this matter, and this is going to be a huge issue for him and a very important topic.
So likewise, Larissa, in China, right? China has made a massive commitment to net zero. They need to make some major progress at home if the world is to make any progress on climate globally. Can you talk about the sustainability outcomes then from the trip? We've kind of touched upon those, but in your view, what were the most meaningful things that came out?
I think by far the most meaningful thing was the joint communique on climate change. That was very important. Through this joint communique, Brazil and China showed their commitment to this topic. And also there was the creation of the subcommission on climate change and energy within COSBAN, the high-level dialogue that Brazil and China hold. It was a long time in the planning, or somehow it was an idea that an environmental discussion was also to be held at COSBAN, and so this was achieved, and I think this really reflects the Chinese commitment to their carbon neutrality goals. What we see almost monthly since China made this commitment public is that they are giving directives, guidelines to provinces, companies, and different ways they have to act. I actually cannot see how companies that operate in China nowadays, either as investors or as trade partners, can have a positive interaction, like a positive agenda with the Chinese government that doesn't mention sustainability and climate change. I think this is also a great opportunity for Chinese companies to take this portfolio overseas, but it is a big opportunity for Brazilian companies that have in China their main customer as well, in the sense that they should take advantage of this concern that is very real and concrete in China, to also make propositions that show they are also compromising in helping the Chinese go after their goals and accomplish their goals. So I think it's a positive item that takes us away from the natural frictions and then natural irritants of just the trade discussion, and helps us have meaningful discussions also for these companies from Brazil operating in China.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is a sort of politically neutral issue and a way to build relations across the board. And then with a lot of the deals then that were signed, there's a business here, right? There's a business around climate. And Claudia, when we were talking yesterday, you were talking about how about a third of the agreements featured sustainability in some way. So we talk a lot about that opportunity in business, but specifically for you, what are the opportunities?
I think there are many, and I think the challenge from the Brazilian perspective will be to transform these deals in concrete investments and business. I think the Brazilian government see this area of energy transition, decarbonization, as an opportunity of reindustrialize Brazil with these new industries related to decarbonization. As Larissa mentioned, China is one of the world leaders, or the world leaders in many of these technologies. In Beijing, in Shanghai, I was impressed with the number of electric cars I saw on the streets. All the buses are electric. The cities are much quieter than they used to be. China is a leader in solar energy, is one of the leaders in wind energy, and has a disposition of investing in hydrogen, green hydrogen. So there are a lot of opportunities for Chinese investments in Brazil in these areas. And I think this could be like a way, if they materialize, if they happen, of Brazil integrate itself in global production chains related to decarbonization. And besides that, I think there are a lot of opportunities for green finance and financing of low carbon agriculture in Brazil. The Brazilian government wants to recuperate or to recover 40 million hectares of land that has been deforested and are currently degraded. They want to convert it in agriculture, in productive land. And if this is made, Brazil could double its agricultural production. But for that, Brazil, the producers need financing. And that would be an opportunity also to obtain financing of low carbon agriculture from Chinese players in Brazil.
Yeah, I completely agree. We have a lot of climate commitments, but the governments can't fund all of the, the commitments and the technology transfers and things that will be required to do this. So one of the things that was interesting that was talked about in the run up to the trip, and we talked about a little bit, was the idea of a Brazil-China Green Fund. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass on this trip, but let's hope it comes to fruition a little bit further along the road, because that will really help, as you outlined. So we're just about at time, and I feel like it flew right by, but I wanted to just close out with a really quick note from each of you too, a really quick recommendation from each of you. There is a little bit of information on the Brazil-China relationship. Both of you obviously specialize in this and would have great places to point us to if we want to read more and follow the Brazil-China relationship more, because it becomes so influential geopolitically now. What do you recommend our listeners do? I'll start with Larissa, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I think most of this content is being generated in Portuguese, or
The
in,
unfortunate part for
sometimes
us, in yeah.
in Chinese. But I do think we have some a good initiatives like Observa China, like China Observer, let's say in English. It's an initiative from a group of young sinologists that have regularly published newsletters and podcasts. We at SEBRI also try to host events that have to do with that area. We have a specific China analysis group, which this year I started to coordinate, which was founded by Professor Ana Jaguaribe and Tatiana Rosito, who is currently our Vice Minister of Economics, of Finance in Brazil, a big China expert as well. So do follow us at SEBRI, and we'll also try to host some of the events in English, and that will help in that regard.
Or just subtitles. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Claudia, your recommendation?
Yeah, I would recommend the webpage of the Brazil-China Business Council, which is cebc.org.br. Every year, we publish a report on Chinese investments in Brazil. The last one is translated to English. And we have also, in the last 2 years, produced recommendations for the Brazilian government for the Brazil-China relationship. One of them was written by Tatiana Rosito, the currently Vice Minister of Finance, and it's called Foundations for a Long-Term Strategy for Brazil to China. And it is in English as well, English, Portuguese, English, and Chinese. And we also published more than 1.5 years ago, a document called Sustainability and Technology as Basis for China-Brazil Cooperation, for Brazil-China Cooperation. And we are very happy to see that many of the suggestions that we made in this document are reflected in the agreements that were signed by. And in our YouTube webpage, you have also all the webinars and events that we've done during the pandemic, and we have some of them in English.
Wonderful, thank you. And Publio?
I would say I would recommend both websites. I think we have some of the main specialists in China here with us. That's a privilege from us to have them talking here. And I would also say that if you want to know a little bit more about China and Brazil, you visit our EGA website. We put some pieces together there also, English and Portuguese. So you're welcome to see it.
Thank you, Publio. Larissa, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at the moment, we have 2 regular columns about China on Brazilian newspapers. So there is the newspaper O Globo, and then journalist Marcelo Nino is currently the only correspondent from Latin America who is based in Beijing. So I do recommend following his columns. And also at Folha de São Paulo, we have Igor Patrick also writing a weekly column that used to be written by Tatiana Prazeres, who is a Vice Minister of Industry and Trade of Brazil at the moment. And Claudia Trevisan also has a lot of good material online. She has been one of our most successful correspondents reporting from Beijing and DC. So she writes eventually for O Estado de São Paulo, and I also recommend you follow her.
Thank you, Larissa.
Thank you all for the recommendations. I appreciate it. And thank you all so much for joining us today to talk about Brazil and China. I think it was really an interesting conversation, just scratched the surface. I'm sure we could delve down into any of these topics that we just glanced over in this discussion in much more detail. So I look forward to future conversations with everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending today's webinar. If you would like further information on today's subject matter, please feel free to reach out to the email address you see on your screen. Thank you and see you next time.